Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Glatstein, who is Rav of Kehilas Tiferes Mordechai and author of a number of books and Sfarim, including the newly published Tzipsa, Yeshua, Yearning for Redemption. This is a translation of the work of the Chofetz Chaim, a very small work, as we'll discuss. It's translated and elucidated, published by ArtScroll, with a number of essays by Rabbi Glatstein in here as well, and we'll be discussing this. I think it's fitting, this episode coming out late in Tisha B'Av. I think it's fitting to discuss the topic of yearning for redemption here at this time of year. So thank you, Rabbi Glatstein, for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me.
So what can you tell listeners about this Sefer Tzipsa Yeshua, and maybe even before we start there, why is it appropriate to discuss this topic on Tisha B'Av?
Okay, that's a question of the day. We know you're not allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av, and a lot of people are asking me, could we learn your new Sefer on Tisha B'Av? And I'm afraid to answer because I'm Nageh B'Davar. I would love to go out and say, everyone buy the new book because that's the only thing you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av. So I actually asked Reb Shmuel first, and he said, yeah, you can learn it. It's about the coming of Mashiach. What could be more appropriate? The Chofetz Chaim wrote many svarim. I actually was recently at his kever in Belarus, which was quite an ordeal getting there today. You need a visa, and it's not as easy to get a visa today as it once was. And on his kever is a list of all the svarim he wrote, I believe in the following order: Chofetz Chaim, Mishnah Brura, Avas Chesed, and so on and so forth. And I'm looking at the list, and Tzipsa Yeshua is not mentioned. So I figured, it's not mentioned. Is it really a sefer? It's more like an essay, like tucked away in Kol Kisvei Chofetz Chaim is a small essay. Maybe it's not really a full sefer. Maybe that's why it's not there. And researching the publication of this work, it became known to me that Chofetz Chaim was not able to publish it as a separate volume in his lifetime because of censorship. What the issue of censorship is, we don't know exactly. But we could only imagine. When the Chofetz Chaim came to publish Sefer Chofetz Chaim, he met up with the censor of the Russian Empire. Was a Jew by the name of Joshua Steinberg, who was one of the leading members of the Haskalah in Vilna, not to be confused with the Haskalah in Germany. Okay, so there was a whole movement of Haskalah in Vilna. The father of Haskalah in Vilna was somebody, Adam HaKohen Levinson, who actually many years prior, he was lurking in the Beis Medrash when the Chofetz Chaim was a young boy and he went to study in Vilna. This Levinson was lurking to try to ensnare the Chofetz Chaim to the seminar, and he would strike up the Chofetz Chaim in conversation, and until some water carrier told this boy, Yisrael Meir, what are you talking to this guy? He's a flagrant violator of halacha. He's an apikoros. And apparently the Chofetz Chaim at least was choishesh for the Lashon Hara because he ran out of Vilna and never came back. Anyway, many years later, Adam HaKohen Levinson's son-in-law, Joshua Steinberg, meets up with the Chofetz Chaim, and he's like Hakei Yashinov that his father-in-law let this boy out of his grasp. And in the course of their conversation, so you can imagine Steinberg's reading this book about what you are or not allowed to say about another Jew, and he's not happy with this topic. He thinks it's a backward topic, and in the course of the conversation, the Chofetz Chaim used the expression lahavdil, and Steinberg got very angry. Lahavdil, there's no difference. All mankind is equal. So you could just imagine if the word lahavdil was something that rubbed the censor the wrong way, then there's no way they're letting a book about the subject of the redemption of the Jewish people and the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel. There's no way that's ever going to pass censorship. So we don't know that conclusively, but that's a very reasonable assumption of what the censorship issue was. And the Chofetz Chaim had to publish Tzipsa Yeshua in a magazine, and we'll talk about that. It's interesting that in 1929, Chofetz Chaim's son-in-law, Rav Aaron HaKohen, who was living first in Yerushalayim, then in Tel Aviv, he published what he thought was the first edition of Tzipsa Yeshua as a separate sefer, and he writes, "This is the first time Sefer Tzipsa Yeshua appears for the Jewish people as a separate sefer. My father-in-law could not publish it due to censorship. He had to stick it into a journal called Hapelas." So for you scholars out there, Hapelas was a newspaper that was published between, I believe, 1900 and 1905. So I figure, okay, let me find which edition of Hapelas. Hapelas is available. It's on Hebrew books, it's on Oitzar Chachma. So I went through all the Hapelases. No, there's no Tzipsa Lishua there. So then a few people told me that the publisher of Hapelas was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Eliyahu Akiva Rabinowitz, who is the Rav in Paltava. After he published Hapelas, he published another magazine between 1910 and 1915. It's called Hamodia, not to be confused with the Hamodia. And sure enough, in the scans of the National Library of Israel, if you look up Tzipsa Yeshua, they have this 8-page pamphlet, and on the final page, it's stamped issue 31, and it says it belongs to a certain edition of Hamodia. In other words, the Chavetz Chaim had it inserted into this magazine the same way, like there's like a Yated insert. So the Chavetz Chaim had it inserted into the Hamodia. There is a bit of a mystery because in the National Library of Israel scans, they have it as a separate scan in the 31st edition, and when you look up their Hamodias, meaning their scans of Hamodias, they have it connected to the 30th edition, and they themselves are not sure which one it really belongs to. They originally scanned the Hamodias, which were somewhere in Russia, so they don't have the original copies. They just scanned it decades ago. So they're not quite sure which edition it belongs to. But it originally appeared in Hamodia. What's interesting is that the 1929 edition of Tzipsa Yeshua, which the Chavetz Chaim's son-in-law said is the first edition, was actually not the first edition. The first edition was published in 1921. I'm just looking on my desk because I bought the first edition, 1921 edition. I bought it on eBay. It was published, so I was able to get it on eBay, Tzipsa Yeshua. This is translated into Yiddish by Rav Yosef Meir Jacobson, a rabbi in Boston. So, and he translated in Yiddish, and it's interesting, in the beginning of the book, he writes certain things he heard personally from the Chavetz Chaim when he was learning in Radin about the coming of Mashiach. And actually, as this book was going to print, a cousin of mine, Heshi Pinter, he told me his father was my wife's uncle, my uncle, Itchy Pinter. He was working in a hospital, and somehow he got his hands on a letter from the Chavetz Chaim. And he said, "Oh, you're writing on Tzipsa Yeshua? I think I have a letter from the Chavetz Chaim about Tzipsa Yeshua." So he sends me a copy of the letter. The letter was a letter from the Chavetz Chaim written to this Rabbi Jacobson, and the Chavetz Chaim is thanking Rabbi Jacobson for translating the Tzipsa Yeshua. And the Chavetz Chaim says he thinks it's a good idea that American Jews should be inspired to yearn for Mashiach. So that the 1921 edition is really the first publication of Tzipsa Yeshua in a Sefer. And now it's available in English.
With the Hebrew, and you really recount this tale, this fascinating story about his publication history and this question of censorship that you're still not quite sure what was going on there. So let's talk about the Sefer, or as you say, really an essay, small, 18 pages or so. What was the original?
8 pages,
something like that. 8 pages. Yeah. So let's talk about the Sefer, the Chavetz Chaim, why the Chavetz Chaim wrote it, what it was, and why you decided to, now you're going to publish this in a Hebrew-English annotated edition with essays.
It seems like the Chavetz Chaim would have liked to publish it as a separate volume, but whenever the typical yeshiva student or scholar tries to get their hand on Tzipsa Yeshua, they can never get a separate volume. It's always like tucked away in the Kol Kisvei Chavetz Chaim. So I think what happened to it is what the Gemara describes with the Treyasar, with Aidi Dezutar Erkasle. When something's really small, it just gets lost. So I thought it was a worthwhile idea to give the Sefer independent attention. And in order to do that, you need to somehow make it worthy of being a separate volume. So how do you make it worthy of being a separate volume? You got to give it some bulk, Certainly an English translation will give it attention, especially with published by ArtScroll. And here's one thing that I think is a contribution to the Tzipsa Yeshua. The Chavetz Chaim is trying to persuade his reader that the likelihood of the coming of Mashiach is stronger in his time, 100 years ago, than it ever was. And the Chafetz Chaim explains, based on the difficulties of the time, the poverty, and how difficult it was to send children to yeshiva or to raise an observant family. And the Chafetz Chaim describes the ridicule that observant people had to suffer. So while those might have been compelling arguments 100 years ago, I think for the contemporary reader, they might say, really? Is it really hard to send our kids to yeshiva? It goes without saying. What's the alternative? Or ridicule? Most observant Jews live in communities where it's obvious to be an observant Jew. One would be ridiculed if they weren't. So these arguments seem to be not as relevant. So I tried to explain, based on traditional sources, how the arguments of the Chafetz Chaim could really be utilized even in a more compelling way today. For instance, many Sfarim bring, and the Alshich specifically, who writes, the challenge of wealth is considered a greater challenge than poverty, even though that's, most people would say, bring on the challenge of wealth and I'll deal with it. But in reality, it's a bigger challenge. So utilizing the Chafetz Chaim's argument, if Mashiach was more likely to come when Jews were serving Hashem out of poverty, then according to the Alshich, it's even more likely to come in an affluent society. So try to make, preserve the logic of the Chafetz Chaim for our time. That's, I think, one contribution to the Sefer. And by adding essays and explaining how to practically yearn for Mashiach and what it means to yearn for Mashiach. So I hope the topic is given and the Sefer is given the proper attention.
So let's talk about the topic, because that encompasses what the Chafetz Chaim was talking about, and also you go more into your essays, which the obligation to yearn for Mashiach and the source for that. Is there a specific time to discuss some of the essays to wait for Mashiach? Is the belief in Mashiach one of the tenets of Judaism? I think that's one that'll catch people's attention right away and look at it. And you have a number of other essays in here. So if you want to touch on some of those topics, I think it's appropriate now at this time, and also so people can get a flavor of what the Sefer is about.
Yeah, so one very powerful question that actually the Brisker Rav asks on what's attributed to the Rambam. The Rambam says one of the principles of faith is, I believe in the coming of Mashiach, and then the Rambam says, the Rambam seems to have this question. So, what's taking so long? And the answer is, I'm still waiting for him. I don't know where he is, but I'm still waiting for him. So the Brisker Rav points out, since when did the Rambam become one of the Balei HaTosfos, where he's asking afagavs and giving mikomakoims? Tosfos asks temas and b'yesh loimars. There's a shakla v'tarya. The Rambam's a halachis. He just cuts to the chase. So why is the Rambam asking questions? He doesn't ask any questions in any of the other Yud Gimel Ikrim. So basically, the Brisker Rav brings out the point that if you look carefully in the words of the Rambam, the Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam says Mashiach encompasses two tenets of faith. Number one, to believe in his coming, to have an emunah in the reality of Mashiach. But number two, awaiting the coming of Mashiach is an ikar ha'emunah. One may have thought, no, only belief in Mashiach is ikar emunah, and awaiting it is like, some kind of righteous behavior. No, it's not righteous behavior. It's a tenet of belief where one is required not only to believe in it, but to actively await his coming. So the question is, as you mentioned, so what's the source of this? We're in the Chumash. You can't make up a tenet of belief. Where in the Chumash does it say such a thing? So there are different possible sources. The Brisker Rav uncovers a source, and a lot of the Sefer discusses the approach of the Smak. The Smak says the very first mitzvah in the Torah, the mitzvah of Anoichi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzisicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. By the way, on the Smak, the Chidah says, I see you have the nice set of Chidah behind you. Chidah and Shem Agdolim says, I think every Svarim Chatter podcast has to quote the Chidah and Shem Agdolim at least one time. It's one of the rules. It should, right? I think the Chidah says that when the Smak wrote the Sefer, Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbel, 1280 France, he says that Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbel wanted the Smak to be widespread in all of Klal Yisrael, so he sent a copy to every community, and he said each community should purchase the Smak on their own bill, and everyone should learn it. The thing is, when the Smak came to a community, and the community opens it up, and it's not quite like their own minhagim, so the rabbi of the community had to add on the bottom, here in Chves, in Borough Park, we do this. I'm just obviously not in Borough Park, but so I was recently in Zurich in one of the prints of the Smak. You have Smak Zurich. What's Smak Zurich? the rabbi in Zurich, who was a Rishon, Rav Moshe of Zurich, he wrote his comments on the Smak. So in his comments on the Smak, on this first mitzvah, he said, okay, the Almighty comes and says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Yeah, okay. What do you want? So very nice. Good to know that. What are you asking me to do? So the Smak interprets, what I'm asking you to do is, just like you know I took you out of Egypt, you have to actively yearn for the coming of the Geula. That's the meaning of that mitzvah. And based on that, I think maybe a chidush that the Sefer discusses at length. Yeah, I think it's a chidush, but it's also obvious that if implicit in awaiting and implicit in belief in the Exodus and belief in Yetzias Mitzrayim is that Hashem is going to redeem us, that means every mitzvah that we do that commemorates Yetzias Mitzrayim should also be an opportunity to await the coming of Mashiach. So you put on tefillin, you look at a mezuzah, you say Kriya Shema, you make kiddush. It's not only an opportunity to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's also an opportunity to await the coming of the Geula. So I think that's like a chiddush in not just halach, in practice, in basic Jewish practice.
As we said, this is a annotated and translated into English edition with the Hebrew of the Chofetz Chaim's Piece of Yeshua, the classic ArtScroll layout, ArtScroll font. That's in the beginning. It has your introduction about the censorship, fascinating story for those interested, and then you have your number of essays in the back. So, what are you trying to accomplish with the Sefer?
I guess I'm humbly trying to bring the message of the Chofetz Chaim that he wanted to accomplish 100 years ago, to instill a genuine yearning for Mashiach for the people of his time. I think it's appropriate that in our time and the challenges that we face, we should have a reminder as well that even though, look, we're very involved in doing mitzvahs, but after all, there are 6 biggies that we're going to have to answer after 120. They're not asking, did you keep Shabbos? Obviously, you're going to have to there's an accountability for that. Obviously, there's an accountability for all 613. But one of the big 6 is Tzipsa Yeshua, and therefore this needs to be at the forefront of our attention. So that's really the main topic of the book, aside from some innovative ideas about the topic.
And who would you say the Sefer is meant for?
It's meant for anyone anyone whose mother is Jewish and is part of the Jewish people, and takes seriously their personal obligation and would like to heighten their awareness of and their personal attention to yearning for Mashiach. I think this book could assist them.
Okay, so I'll link to the book in the show notes, and we should all be zeicha to the Gula Kroiva, and like the Novi Yirmiyahu says in Eicha, Shivenu Hashem Elecha V'Nashuva Chadei Shemenu Kekedem.
Amen.
Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.